Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. And as you can see, we have a full panel, so we were worried if you don't come after lunch, we'll talk among ourselves, and we'll still make a productive conversation. But you are here, and so hopefully we'll have a lot of time for interaction. I would do better on time management compared to what I did this morning. So we have a panel talking about with the topic of can donors build institutions, or can donors help build institutions? I hope, and it's a question I'm sure a lot of practitioners have in mind. And Nigel Roberts, who was on the panel this morning, talked about WDR 2011, the focus on how to build legitimate institutions. Right, the spiral that if you remember from 2011, how do we build a dynamic where gradually you signal and you fulfill and you start building that commitment, that credible commitment and the trust. And today, this panel will actually go down to those details in thematic areas. I think we have Simon, who has worked a lot in budgetary institutions, public financial management areas in many difficult places. He heads the Budget Strengthening Initiative, ODI. And Simon will share his experience in terms of building accountable public financial management institutions. And Sophie works on health system. Sophie is from let me just read properly. Sophie Witter is Professor of International Health Financing and Health Systems at the Institute for International Health and Development, Queen Margaret University, Edinburgh. And her research is on health worker incentives as part of the Rebuild Research Consortium. So I think we will hear another thematic cut in terms of building institutions in a sector. Wilson and Vanessa work on a different project, a taxation project. Wilson Pritchard is Assistant Professor of Political Science and Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. He's a Research Director of the International Center for Tax and Development and Research Fellow at the Institute of Development Studies. I think together you're working on taxation. I think this book that I just advertised your book, Taxation, Responsiveness, and Accountability in Sub-Saharan Africa. And tax, as you know, is an extremely important institution of extraction and hopefully also using the resource to deliver. So there will be linkage upstream, downstream with the other speakers as well. And Hamish is a fellow from ODIs, and they're working on an interesting empirical project at the moment to really look at the household perception of state legitimacy in post-conflict settings for empirical inquiries. So legitimacy in the end is empirical, both an interesting conceptual discussion, but we want to hear the empirics, exactly what type of things influence people's perception of state legitimacy, and especially after war. And this morning's discussion already alluded to multiple dimensions. Legitimacy, not just in terms of the social compact, citizens expecting the state to deliver, but also legitimacy in terms of how resources, how power is shared in the society, and how decisions are made in the society, whether that's perceived as fair and just. And we want to hear more on the empirical side. So Hamish, very much looking forward to your discussion. And then we have Steve Cummins, who actually is the real convener of this panel. Steve has worked in the bank for a long time, but also now is teaching in UCLA. And Steve has been involved in many WDRs and has seen the sort of evolution of thinking in institution building, both in the WDR 2004 and then later WDR 2011, and now helping us also with the WDR 2017. So Steve will discuss the presentations of this panel and then provoke some discussion with the audience. We'll start with Simon. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's difficult coming on immediately after lunch, but hopefully I can keep you both entertained and interested and a little bit challenged towards the end. The presentation I'm giving is almost like an elongated advert for a series of publications we've got. The Budget Strengthening Initiative has been going for 5 years, and we've got a large publication which distills some of the lessons we've learned from working supporting ministries of finance in South Sudan, in Liberia, and also in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's some shorter briefing notes which are on the table outside. One is some tips for those of you involved in reform, and there's a third briefing note which is about the role and behaviour of external actors. And what I'm going to try and do is give you edited highlights of those publications, but for those of you who are really interested, you might want to read the books as well. We've been working, as I said, for about 6 years. The Budget Strengthening Initiative started in about 2010. It was specifically designed to, I suppose, put ODI as a think tank, a development institute, but to put some of our thinking into practice, to see if we could actually do some of the things that we write and talk about into practice in developing countries, but particularly in fragile states. The thrust is about working primarily with ministries of finance, but we've also done quite a lot of work in terms of supporting service delivery. So that's the resonance with some of the other speakers on the panel. The title is a fairly simple one in the sense, can donors support the building of institutions? I think the answer is, the straight answer is no, they can't. It's governments themselves that need to build their own institutions. But donors can help and can assist and can support. I think it's also true to say that donors can sometimes hinder as well. So I want to just talk ourselves through some of those points. But there's a number of things to remember, and this is really the structure of what I want to say. Things happen, fragile states are fragile. The countries in which we're involved in South Sudan, we've had conflict, we've had oil shutdowns. In Liberia, we've had the impact of Ebola, we've had to withdraw teams, we had to bring them back in. Stuff happens in the countries in which we were concerned about. Important to start where the organisation is, understanding the context by talking to the players on the ground, by talking with government, what's their problem. Don't impose best practice. It's not just systems and processes, but engaging with people. Donors need to change. And I've got a set of propositions to set out to you to help you as you engage on this topic. So firstly, what does the context look like? This is our schema of our engagement with South Sudan. A number of things to point to there. The faces at the bottom are the fact that since 2011, there's been 4 separate ministers of finance in the country. 2012, the South Sudan became independent in 2011. 2012, the oil was shut down. 2013, the end of 2013, conflict broke out. There's also issues now, decline in the dollar, fall in the oil price. All these things have happened. So building institutions or supporting governments to build institutions, it's not a linear thing. And we might want to talk later on in the discussion about how log frames and donor instruments help you in that. But I suppose the point I'm making is it's not linear, it's a wiggly line, things happen. And our institution building has to take place amongst all those things that are going on. And one of the things that we think we've learned from the thing is if you, and I had a previous incarnation with DFID, sometimes working with the ministers of finance or engaging at that level doesn't always help you if they keep changing. So a lot of the work we've been doing has been engaging at the mid-level with senior to mid-level people in the Ministry of Finance because they've provided continuity as the project has gone through. And I recall my previous incarnation with DFID that we spend ages trying to get in to see ministers of finance and engage with them and get sometimes ministers to sign up to things. But in fact, the ministers aren't always the people who get things done. They need to give the permission, but they aren't always the people who get things done. So engaging at the middle level is important. The other thing to do is start with a problem and an opportunity. it's about building trust and listening and working with government. One of the things we've done, we work to a sort of flexible, what we call a problem-driven approach. And one of the things that's refreshing, we have flexible funding initially from DFID and latterly from Swedish CEDA, is being able to go into ministries of finance and say, you know, what is your main constraint? What's your real issue? Not to impose a mechanistic solution, of which public financial management is full of many, but to try and understand what is the real problem in that country. Interestingly enough, earlier last year, in the middle of the Ebola crisis, asking the Ministry of Finance in Sierra Leone, what is their main problem? What is their main constraint? What's the main thing that's binding them? They said, the issue for us is cash management. We can't work out on a week-by-week basis how much money is coming in to the central treasury and working out how to prioritize expenditure going through. So one of the things that we've been doing in Sierra Leone is working with the government, the Ministry of Finance, to try and improve the weekly flow of finance through the Ministry of Finance, which in its turn will lead to predictable funding to like ministries like health. So one of my contentions in a finance field is that if you're going to improve service delivery in the Ministry in Sierra Leone and you're going to make the Ministry of Health more resilient, you've got to find a way to get predictable, reliable finance through to the Ministry of Health. So the key point here is starting with a problem and an opportunity. My second point, which I've sort of, I suppose, made already, is let's not impose best practice. Let's not overload the system. Many times we come with lots. Mary Lee Grindle has the phrase, good enough governance. We have lots of things that we think government should do, but the challenge is what's the right thing to do, what's just enough to do. And obviously you can see by the diagram, remember that truck represents a whole load of brilliant ideas that donors have loaded onto the back, and the result is the truck's completely tipped up. And some of the other research that we've done in ODI is about, basic budgeting. What are the elements of a very basic elementary budget? What are the key things that are needed? And let's not overload it with a lot of other things. If you can't, in Sierra Leone, if you can't almost manage the money from a week-to-week basis, developing an annual budget or a medium-term expenditure framework maybe are not the immediate priorities. So start with an issue, start with a problem, and let's not impose best practice. I think I've got The other thing I just wanted to make a point of is it's not just systems and processes, but it's about engaging with people. Some of this probably isn't as clear on the slide as it would like to be. That's why you'll have to read the briefing note where it's much clearer. But we engage, institutions are made and organizations are made up of people, and people have their own incentives, their own drivers, their own pressures, and it's somehow understanding and working with them on the issues and problems that they face. It's about building trust with people. One of the other things that we've learned in the countries in which we've operated is getting people who've got long experience of engaging with that country. One of the common complaints which came out of a meeting yesterday is that donors don't have staff in country long enough. We've got somebody on our South Sudan team who operates as a key interlocutor with government, the interfacing between the technical work that we do and the political level, whose engagement with South Sudan and politicians in South Sudan goes back over 30 years. And many of the people we try to use have got long history of that country, and we also employ many people who are ex-ODI fellows who are their experiences of working in an embedded way within a ministry. But it's about building people, enabling them to become catalysts of change themselves. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves sometimes is, are we making their life easier and helping them deliver, or are we making their life more complicated? Is it better that we're there? The next slide is, I just wondered if, depending on if you're falling asleep, you might want to, do a quick yoga pose. But my point is donors need to change. I was in Ethiopia a month or so ago, and I was speaking to somebody in the finance section of the Ministry of Health who was saying that they manage 159 donor projects in Ethiopia in the Ministry of Health. So their ability to impose financial systems which improve the ability of the Ethiopians to manage their own money is constrained by the fact that we as donors require them to have separate reporting for 159 projects and programs. So there's challenges there. In terms of the role of external actors, we've tried to categorize the role that we play both as technicians. We bring some technical expertise, but it's important to be a trusted advisor, somebody who facilitates and brokers and makes connections between different bits of ministries. And we found we've spent a lot of time, particularly in our service delivery work in South Sudan, making the linkages and connections between the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education and other ministries like that. And the final slide is a set of propositions that you may want to think about and maybe we may want to come back to in discussions. Do we really understand the context? And not just do we understand, but do we understand the context from the people we're working with? What's their context? What's their issue? What's their constraint? What are their immediate priorities? What are they really concerned about? Let's not overburden them with a range of stuff when they have a concern about something more fundamental or something more relevant. In the briefing notes, we talk a little bit about space for reform. What's the space for reform? One of the things that we found is that in many cases where there's the politics dictate you can't implement certain things, but there may be space to do certain things. And there's quite a nice analogy in the briefing notes which describe the space for reform and what that space for reform may enable you to do, but also conversely not do. What role can you play? Are you supportive? Are you facilitative? What do you do? The point about engaging with the people on the inside and in the middle, don't just spend your time trying to see the Minister of Finance. Are you engaging with the middle-level technicians? And one of my regrets about working in development for 30 years is when I first started with DFID working in the Ministry of Finance in Lesotho, donor staff used to engage regularly with medium-level officials. Nowadays, my previous incarnation with DFID was in Tanzania. We were on the 5th floor of a building in Dar es Salaam. We had very little engagement with colleagues in the Ministry of Finance, and that's a regret and means we're not engaging with the people that we need to who will build and develop the institution. Measure the small steps, keep the vision, demonstrate your usefulness, be trusted, be reliable, make the connections. The UK government isn't as joined up as it should be. Governments, whether in South Sudan or Liberia, are not joined up either. So often we as outside players can help join the dots, help make connections across government. Recognise that donor behaviour can be unhelpful. I understand even in the World Bank that most of your financial expertise in the World Bank is focused on the fiduciary risk within your own institution. Managing the fiduciary risk of your own donor isn't helping the fiduciary risk that the Ethiopian taxpayer or the Sierra Leonean taxpayer is facing. So sometimes our own behaviour can be unhelpful. Beware of intermediaries. I suppose ODI, in a sense, or the work we do, sometimes we're an intermediary in one sense, but you need, if you're a donor, you need to engage directly with the ministry and directly with colleagues in the ministry. And you need to learn to be flexible and adaptable. And we've got some things we could share about the way our monitoring and evaluation frameworks work, the ability we've had flexible core funding from both DFID and CEDA, which enables us to be very responsive to the needs and demands of our partners. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think Will and Vanessa will share their experience with taxation. And it'll be interesting to actually see whether the lessons Simon draws from their work in public financial management also resonate in the other areas. So Will, I will give you a warning at 8 minutes. And then I think Steve gave you 10, 12 minutes. Let's keep the first round 10 to 12 minutes each, so we can allow interactive session in the second round.
Great. I will move quickly then. Building on Simon's excellent introduction, I'm going to focus this presentation broadly on the interface between taxation, decentralization, and local state building and institution building, and asking whether taxation can act as a driver for institutional development at the local level after conflict. In particular, I'm going to focus on the role of informal taxation and really ask Simon's first question, which is, do we properly understand the context for reform? And I'll suggest that some of our recent research suggests the context might be different than what we thought it was, and we may therefore need to think a bit differently about the role of taxation in building new institutions after conflict. I'm here presenting with my colleague Vanessa. I'm going to do the talking now, given the limits of time, but she'll certainly help me in answering questions. In broad terms, our starting point is an emerging narrative that suggests that taxation can be an entry point for strengthening governments and institutions after conflict. This narrative is increasingly well known and really flows through two broad ideas. The first is that taxation can be the leading edge of state building and institution building. That is, collecting taxes is challenging, it's complex, and when we build tax systems locally, that also spurs the development of broader state infrastructures. The second part of this story is one about accountability. When governments are forced to raise taxes locally from their citizens, that puts pressure on governments to be accountable to those citizens, to encourage compliance, and it puts pressure on citizens to demand things in return. Thus, we hope, building a new and stronger social contract. This narrative is particularly attractive because in some ways it localizes and endogenizes the process of local state building. It's not someone from the outside who builds institutions, it's the process of raising taxes that spurs a local process of strengthening the state and accountability. But the question we've tried to ask through the work of the International Center for Tax and Development is whether in practice taxation does play this role as a spur to state building at the local level. Because while the narrative is convincing and compelling, we also know that as with many development fads, we don't want to oversimplify a good but ultimately much more complex idea. And there are a variety of reasons why this connection between taxation and local state building may not be so simple. There are often limited capacity and incentives locally. We know local states can often be predatory, while tax systems are enormously complex. We know that local collective action to respond to taxation is very difficult. But in particular right now, I want to focus on this last point, which is the idea that when we focus only on formal tax systems, we may be overlooking what we'll call informal tax systems, which profoundly shape the nature of local realities, but may force us in fundamental ways to reassess our approach to local tax reform and institution building. So what do I mean when I say informal taxes? In a broad sense, and I could embellish on this in questions, we're talking about all tax-like payments, whether cash or in kind, including in labor, that are made outside of statutory laws, that should say. And so this is taxes, fees, rates, but all the things that look like taxes, but they're being collected by state officials, but off the books, that's informal state taxes, or they're being collected by traditional authorities, or they're being collected by a variety of non-state actors. That might be community development associations, religious organizations, local arms groups, and so on. And our view is if we capture all of those things that we know exist at the local level, our view of local taxation may actually be quite different. And that may force us to reassess how we've thought about a whole host of tax-related questions conventionally. It may force us to reassess what tax burdens are at the local level. We often assume that local people pay very little in taxation. This may suggest they pay much more. It may force us to reassess how tax reform is pursued and the barriers to effective tax reform at the local level. It may force us to think again about the links between tax and service provision, particularly if non-state actors are collecting a lot of revenue, but potentially also delivering services. And finally, it forces us to rethink the potential links between taxation, state building, and institutional development. With those questions in mind, what I'd like to just highlight very briefly here is new research we've been carrying out at the ICTD to investigate these questions in much more detail than the earlier literature, and in more detail in two particular ways. First, we've tried to adopt a very holistic definition of informal tax in order to map systematically all of the things that people pay locally that look something like taxes, so we have a full view of the reality on the ground. And second, we're then trying to take those research messages and think about what they might mean for policy. And there are two studies in particular I'll flag. The first was a study of about 1,100 households in the eastern part of Sierra Leone, carried out about 2 years ago. And more recently, a survey of 2,400 households and 1,000 or so businesses in the DRC, from which we're just beginning to get data back. So what have we learned very quickly? What are the key messages that are beginning to come out? Focusing first on Sierra Leone, the first message is these informal taxes are in fact pervasive and at some basic level mean we need to rethink how we've thought about taxation locally. About 50% of what local people were paying in Sierra Leone was not formal, but was informal. And most of that informal wasn't bribes, but instead was payments to non-state actors, in that case chiefs and local community development associations in particular. Second, it's not just that informal taxes are a large share, it's that they're large in absolute terms, but also highly regressive, both formal and informal taxes. And so you can see here for people in our lowest quintile, they're spending about 16% of their estimated income in tax payments, formal and informal, about evenly split. But that proportion is less than half for richer people, right? So the burden is heavy, but it's also regressive. And finally, and in some ways most interestingly, is we find that when we survey people on their perceptions of these taxes, we find much higher trust and confidence in informal taxes than in formal taxes. That is, people believe that informal taxes are translated into services in a way that they don't believe for formal taxes. Less than 20% think that formal taxes are used for services at least some of the time. About 80% of people think that for informal taxes. We suspect that this reflects two things. One is, perhaps, these non-state actors are actually delivering more at the local level or have better relationships with local taxpayers. But second is also the nature of those payments and taxes. Often those informal payments look more like user fees. There's a closer link between what's paid and what's delivered, but that's not necessarily a bad thing if it's encouraging this greater engagement between citizens and providers. As I said, we only are beginning to get data from the DRC, but it reinforces those messages, but I think also deepens the sense that these are critically important questions, though largely overlooked to date. When we look at the burden of taxation in local areas in the DRC, we find it's even higher. In a lot of the places we surveyed, particularly in cities, the burden of taxation is something above 40% of income for people at the lower end of the income distribution. That is an enormous tax burden on low-income people and totally out of line with what we often think the burden is from looking at official statistics. So that suggests that this is deeply important. We also find in the DRC that more of this shows up as being formal rather than informal in our surveys. But we suggest this tells us something about how local tax systems vary. In Sierra Leone, the system is very simple. In the DRC, the local tax system is tremendously complex. Our suspicion here is that means that state officials and even non-state actors looking to extract from citizens can dress almost anything up as a formal payment because they can dress it up under any of the myriad hundreds of taxes that exist at the local level. But this also makes the point that extraction looks different in the DRC than it does in Sierra Leone, even if the amounts are very large. And finally, we begin to see differences between urban areas and rural areas. As we might expect, the overall burden appears to be heavier in urban areas, but informal taxes, particularly to non-state actors, are relatively more important when we go out to rural areas. There's much more to learn still from the DRC data, but again, we're reporting as we go and as we're learning new things. And I guess the case I wanted to make to you in closing is, although we're just at the beginning of this research program, at least in my mind, we already have enough data to suggest the way we've thought about taxation and its potential contribution to state building, institution building after conflict may be in significant ways misguided because we've been missing this huge part of the story. And I'd flag two potential policy implications. The first is just about thinking about formal sector tax reform. If we want to think about formal sector tax reform, we have to think more about the informal side. Because when you try to reform the formal, you're almost certainly going to encounter the informal. The informal system, which in some ways is competing with the formal system for revenue, but also the informal system, which is interacting very closely with the informal system. In a place like Sierra Leone, you see this very clearly in the powerful role of traditional authorities in shaping the potential for formal reform. So if we're not looking at this, we're missing a big part of the reform story and maybe failing to understand why reform has proven so difficult in practice. The second and more provocative question, also labeled 1, obviously, because it's that important, is are current models for local tax reform realistic and the best available option? And I don't want to suggest they necessarily aren't, but I think the data we've presented so far suggests that they might not be, and we need to think really carefully about this. At a broad level, we have a clear sense people are paying a lot of money, but very little of that money is making it into state coffers. That is an immediate question that needs consideration in thinking about how we design and build these institutions. But more broadly, if we find, as we do in our data, that informal taxes to non-state actors are routinely more popular and more trusted by local populations than formal taxes, do we need to think a little bit about second best or hybrid synergies that accept the fact that those informal systems exist, that they do have a role, and that formal systems may in the short term work with them? And finally, in a broad sense, if we think that over time a move from the informal to the formal is desirable and necessary, how can we think about how that process works in practice, knowing that you probably can't simply replace informal with formal so cleanly, but need to think of a trajectory? I don't think we understand that yet, but I think it suggests that we need to. So I will stop there. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Sophie's next, talking about the health story.
Pretty good.
Moving rapidly through, not letting anyone ask any questions. How do I get out of this? Okay, so we're going to be jumping sectors, but there is a bit of a linkage because there's at least one Sierra Leonean element to each of the presentations so far. So I apologize if you're hearing a bit too much about Sierra Leone. So I'm going to be talking about the health sector, but just to start out, I want to clarify that we didn't start with a research project that looked at institutions. We started with a research project that looked at health system reconstruction post-conflict, with a focus on human resources and health financing. And the reflections about the institution building really arose indirectly out of that research. So the data is kind of indirect here. So we were interested in the extent to which the post-conflict moment offers a kind of window of opportunity, and also how decisions made at that point can affect the longer-term development. And so in 4 case study countries, and I'm just talking about Sierra Leone today, one of the things we looked at was the evolution of policies on human resources for health, and that's the kind of lens through which our views on institutions arose. So I'm going to be trying to talk very quickly about the pattern of interaction that we've observed between donors and the Ministry of Health during this period, and we take the Ministry of Health as a core steward of the sector, so that's why I'm focusing on that institution in this presentation. So what happened with the institution? If it wasn't built, why not? And what lessons can we draw from that? So just to give an overview of the period that we looked at, so the civil war ended in 2002 in Sierra Leone. So we started by looking at how human resource policies had evolved over that time. And essentially what we saw was a kind of breakdown into a series of phases. So in the first phase, obviously after the war, it's all very chaotic, there's low capacity and so on. But then, and multiple actors, as many of you will be familiar with the post-conflict context. But then you get a period during which certain policy development is happening, but looking at that, there was actually relatively little traction with reality. So you have a period during which various formal policies evolve, but actually there's not that much change happening on the ground. So that's the kind of first phase you see there. And then in 2010 came in the Free Healthcare Initiative, and in that there was a kind of coalescing of political will and also support from various donor agencies. And that catalyzed a series of very practical, immediate reforms. Again, this is just looking at HRH, but actually it happened in all the different health system pillars. So suddenly there was an increase in recruitment, there was an increase in salary payments, there was a cleaning of the payroll, there were systems brought in to monitor absenteeism. So suddenly you get a lot of things happening, but then after a couple of years, there's a kind of slowdown in momentum. So that reform has kind of run its course, and you get a bit of a slough. Then the country was hit by Ebola, and now we're seeing a little bit of a repeat of that kind of energy that came in with free healthcare in the form of the post-Ebola investments. So I'm going to just pick up on a couple of things that happened over that time. One is just, I think, a very interesting case study in unintended consequences in the form of a financial scandal. So in 2013, there was an issue around unaccounted for monies from Gavi, which I think in large part related to weak financial, we talked about cash management in Simon's presentation, weak systems for actually tracking and accounting for money. But what happened was the whole top layer of the Ministry of Health was taken out. None of those have actually come back, even though the court cases were sort of inconclusive. But what that meant was that when Ebola hit, you actually had a Ministry of Health that had lost almost all its top leadership, and some of those posts still haven't been filled till today. Now, obviously, that's not an intentional thing, but that's one of those unfortunate things that happen. And just to give one example of that, the Health Financing Unit in the Ministry of Health, through the entire Ebola period, was staffed by one ODI fellow, who'd obviously gone there to learn. She hadn't gone there to lead a unit. She just ended up accidentally in that position because nobody else was around. Okay, so this is one of the ways in which donors affect institutions unintentionally. So then when Ebola hit, the ministry was very slow to respond. You can see that the quote at the bottom in our interviews, it was regarded as part of the problem, that this was a weak ministry. So this is one of those classic downward spirals of non-institution building. So then parallel structures come in, command and control systems, bringing in highly paid diaspora staff. Those are still in place. We still have the parallel systems that are the kind of legacy of that going down to the district level, and it's proving still quite difficult to manage. The final phase then sees a lot more resources coming in, but still this problem of rival centres of power. So you've got a number of different units, most of them with more influence than the Ministry of Health, which are implementing or developing policy and implementing it as well. And just to give one example, because it's funded by the World Bank, there's a health system strengthening hub. It was supposed to be in the ministry. It's in fact not in the ministry. It's running in parallel with much more highly paid staff, developing a lot of policies and flagship programs. Now, again, the basic problem is if you have a weak institution, you end up bypassing it, you thereby weaken it. And this is perhaps quite a familiar scenario from other places. Meanwhile, we're going back into another series of reforms in health in human resource area, which really echo the period of the free healthcare. We're seeing some of the same things happening again, things like payroll cleaning. It's very fascinating. Why is it that you have to have a constant repeat of activities carried out by external technical assistants, which should really be internal functions of the institution? Okay, so what are the patterns, and is capacity being built? I think you can sort of see where I'm going with that one, so I'll let you answer that yourself. But essentially, there are some clear factors, both external and internal, which are contributing to it. And these echo some of the points made by my colleagues. So the unpredictability of funding, the short-term focus often, the emphasis on external technical assistance, and very common issues like brain drain and distraction with payment to per diems and so on. On the internal side, ministry obviously also hasn't helped itself. It's got problems with chronic underfunding. They've not grasped the nettle of reforming, but also really failure to address some of the systemic weaknesses. So in conclusion, in the context where institution building is especially needed, those are the situations in which it appears to be done least well, which is, of course, one of those paradoxes. What are the lessons we can draw from that? I think, again, echoing what my colleagues are saying, one issue is clearly this long-term partnership, so people who really understand the institutional context, which is what Simon was saying. Also supporting systems that function in that context. Payroll that can be managed by people in the ministry that doesn't require constant infusion of external technical expertise. And helping, I think, really echo this comment about horizontal linkages. The Ministry of Health really struggles to have strong relationships with the Ministry of Finance, other ministries, but also to connect down to the district level. Transparency and accountability clearly need to be strengthened. And just to give one very sobering figure, the last joint programme of work from 2010 to 2014, in a recent assessment, only 5% of the actions in that were actually carried out fully. And I think something like 25 partially. So what that tells you is government and donors who've both committed to doing things, they're just not delivering. And there's very little accountability, including for donors and for the NGOs who are working, often funded by them, for those types of failures. So I'm not going to go through all those points because I can hear a beeping going on. In order to do that, I think there are some important internal lessons for donors. And again, this issue of staff turnover is really key. We look at DFID, for example, who's also funding our research program. They have new health advisors over the last period that changed over every 3 months. So it's really, really hard to work and learn any lessons if you've got people who are turning over that quickly. So they're not building their institutional memory. And also, as a group, are not learning effectively about how to address institution building. So I think I would really echo Simon's comment about fundamentally the responsibility for institutional development lies internally. It's not an external function. But nevertheless, the question of do no harm is really important. So because I think what this case study, and it's just one and it's anecdotal, but it's one that you'll probably most of you recognize, is that donors can do a tremendous amount of harm. So this creation of parallel structures and power bases, bypassing of core institutions, taking staff out, providing funds in a way that undermines the authority of some of these key stewards. These are all behavior patterns which really have to be addressed if we're at all serious. We have a whole series of reports that talk about some of these issues. I haven't put them up because my slides were brutally trimmed by our chair, but you can find them all. You can find them all on the Rebuild website. Thank you very much.
Here, Michelle.
Right. It's interesting to go last because I think this presentation is the one which is probably least directly linked to the question of what donors can do or concrete exercises in building institutions. But maybe it speaks to sort of the foundation of what underneath that, of what we expect institutions to do in post-conflict states, and also how institutions can garner legitimacy to allow them to perform the functions that we want them to function, to perform more easily. What I want to do is present very stylized findings from a large research consortium called the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium. There are 10 partners in all, led by ODI, and the program has been going on for a number of years. It involves a panel survey in 5 post-conflict settings, and it also involves a significant amount of really quite varied qualitative work in a number of countries. So in this amount of time, clearly, we're going to be glossing over a huge amount of empirical work that's gone on. The other caveat about it is that we're reporting on the first round of the panel survey still. The second round has been carried out, and the analysis of that data is beginning, and in this year we'll be synthesizing that. So in a way, the longitudinal part of this panel survey and the interesting dimensions that introduces will be further developed. Part of this survey, part of this study, which covers a range of themes, is focused on the question of services and how they contribute to the way people perceive government in post-conflict situations or in conflict-affected situations. And implicit or underneath that research question is this kind of capacity deficit model of fragile states, that states are built through their ability to deliver services or to carry out institutional functions, and therefore a fragile state is one that doesn't do that. And following from that, the implicit or explicit notion that you can build legitimacy by providing services. Now, this is a really caricatured way of the way we think about institution building in post-conflict situations now, but I think it's still a very important implicit set of assumptions that informs in practice what happens in many programs, and that's why the research is important. I'm going to report basically on 4 of the main hypotheses that were tested and are continuing to be tested in the survey data. Again, this is glossing over a significant amount of qualitative work that also helps us to nuance that data. The first hypothesis is just about access. respondents living in households that have better access, i.e. have accessed facilities more frequently or have to travel less time to get to them, et cetera, across several sort of sectors will have more positive perceptions of the government. In brief, the first round survey data doesn't show a consistent pattern or a linear pattern in this respect. People who, within countries, who have greater access to services do not necessarily have more positive perceptions measured in a couple of different ways of either local or central government. There are some examples where, for example, travel time does influence this, and there's an interesting consistency across 3 of the countries where recipients of a social protection transfer in the last year have had a change, do reflect a relationship with their perception of government. A second hypothesis is around the experience of those services, both in the sense of a generalized sort of set of instruments around how people feel about the service, and a more specific set of questions around whether they've experienced problems. There is a more consistent set of results around this hypothesis, and in particular, when problems are experienced, the respondents are less likely to feel local government in particular makes decisions that reflect their priorities. A third hypothesis relates to the follow-on from these questions about problems, which is what kinds of grievance mechanisms or ways to interact with the services are there available. And here, this is still further a more significant factor in determining people's perception of government. What is particularly interesting here is that there's a fairly consistent finding across 3 of the countries at least, that even without experiencing a problem, the knowledge of the existence of grievance mechanisms is a significant factor in how people perceive local government and central government are responsive to their concerns. And then there's a general set of instruments about levels of civic participation. Are there planning meetings in communities around the delivery of service X or service Y? And here we find that there is a strong result, and opening up spaces and opportunities for community members to engage in these processes of provisions seems to quite consistently improve the way they think about government, both locally, but also in a tempered way, centrally. What's particularly interesting as well across these hypotheses is there's quite a lot of variation in how local perceptions of local and central government differ from each other, in some cases running in the same direction, and in some cases running in different directions. So again, to stylize these findings, perceptions of quality, and particularly the experience of problems, matter more than measures of simple access. And having mechanisms of engagement between service provision and communities seem to matter the most out of the hypotheses that are looked at in this part of the survey. However, the way these play out, particularly between local and central government, are really tempered, and the qualitative work is very important in this respect as well, are tempered by perceptions, expectations, and other factors. We think that this work has the potential to kind of extend thinking about legitimacy, although we're very careful to emphasize that the measurement of perceptions about government is not equal to legitimacy, and is not the only way to try to look into the problem of legitimacy. There's a broad field of empirical and theoretical work about how to do that, and this only looks at this particular perceptual dimension. But one of the things that we think can happen here is that beyond the sort of obvious grade school performance version of legitimacy about whether there are clinics, access to those clinics and other services, to process type dimensions of legitimacy, are people participating, how is it carried out, what kind of quality is involved. There is also a dimension of relational foundations to legitimacy, or having to do with the way people's norms and expectations shape the translation of what they're experiencing into perceptions about government. And we think this is particularly important in this vertical dimension, relating how people feel about local government and central government. We think this sort of avenue is also interesting because it allows us to ask questions about whether there are particular qualities of post-conflict or conflict-affected settings. For example, are norms and expectations potentially much more volatile because there may be many actors coming in and introducing new programming and efforts to establish services, rapidly rebuild, and how does that influence the way people think about who should be providing what services are available, what it means if they're providing it, et cetera. And again, this also extends thinking about legitimacy by differentiating the local vertical relationships. And here, I think there's kind of tentatively a really interesting link with an area of work known as political settlements analysis. Political settlements have varied definitions, but one aspect of many of the definitions is that it's a set of understandings about how elites relate to each other, and particularly around collective action or the division of spoils. But it's also a set of understandings about how elites legitimate themselves in the eyes of their followers. And there may be an interesting line of inquiry. I wouldn't say that this study answers it, but rather going forward to look at whether we can operationalize the concept of a political settlement, at least in this vertical dimension. How are elites legitimating themselves? And see if that has an impact on whether services matter, don't matter, in which direction they matter. So for example, elites whose position has never rested on the provision of services, but may rest on their management of processes of violence, for example, or their management of community security, may have a different impact on how people translate the experience of services to their perceptions of those actors. Finally, I just want to just say a word as we're in the building. We think that there's an interesting link between this work, some of which, as I said, is still speculative, and the framework emerging for the 2017 WDR, which centers on functions of institutions of governance and the constraints that prevent those institutions from performing functions. Legitimacy, why do we care about it? We don't care about it in an abstract sense. We think it's an important factor in institutions' ability to perform their coordinating, commitment, and cooperation functions at relatively low cost. And the framework I've described suggests that aspects of performance or capacity, as it's described in the framework for the WDR, and process or are important for legitimacy, but so too is this social compatibility constraint, which could be translated in other terms as the alignment between the way services influence perceptions and aspects of norms and expectations, political settlement, and legitimation. I'll stop there, and hopefully, I've purposely not gone into any of the technical details of the survey. We do have people in the room who have been working on it throughout the life of the SLRC, so in discussion that can be brought up, but I didn't think that was in the interest of time. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Hamish. Now Steve will help us make sense of all.
As the person who was ruthless about the slides and the timing, I don't want Sophie to give me the baleful glare that I promised her from her earlier slide pack. So I will be very brief as I discuss it. I just want to raise a few broader points in terms of this issue of institutions. And to keep myself very disciplined, I'll tell you ahead of time, there's 5 points. The first is the time frame involved. The second is the nature of imagined communities. The third is what I call the two-track problem. The fourth is the nature of hybrid or asymmetric governance. And the fifth is pogo, as in we have met the enemy and he is us. There is a apocryphal story, but still one I like, that when Charles de Gaulle asked Zhou Enlai about the meaning of the French Revolution, the response was it was too soon to tell. And one of the realities about post-conflict fragile states is that the donor's time frame is driven by the donors, by politicians, and by budgets. It has nothing to do with our historic understanding of state formation or political settlements. Working on the World Development Report 2004 and its aftermath, I did quite a bit of work in Uganda and Cambodia, and was quite struck that 20 years after the arrival of Museveni and almost 15 years after the Paris Peace Agreement, these were very poor, at best mediocre governed countries. Most of the citizens were much better off, obviously, than the years of Pol Pot or Idi Amin, but they were not on the road to Denmark. I'm not quite sure what road they were on. If we look today at Hun Sen and Museveni, who still managed to be around, we can see the time frame for change is quite difficult. And I enjoyed Simon's slide with this up, down, sideways, and backwards of Sudan, and it reminded me of an article written right after the end of the Cold War that history doesn't march forward. History is a drunk who lurches and falls down in the gutter and staggers and gets up again. So one critical aspect about institutions is the time frame involved. The second, which ties a lot into this issue of legitimacy or bureaucracy, comes back to the work of Benedict Anderson, who recently died. But we should remember his work on imagined communities, that nation states, not states as bureaucracies, but nation states where there's a common sense of identity, this is much more involved than whether the state functions. And we see consistently in many parts of the world where you may have a functioning or non-functioning bureaucracy. I would take the United Kingdom or disuniting kingdom as a good example, and yet, for a variety of reasons, my cousins, distant since I have some Northern Irish blood, my cousins in the north across the channel seem to want to leave. So the imagined community involves a lot of history. Sri Lanka is not just about the functioning of the state, it's about the long-term binary nature of Tamil and Sinhala identity and the narratives they have created. Baluchistan's inclusion in Pakistan, even if there were a peaceful settlement in Baluchistan today, there are a lot of other issues involved. And I would remind us also, this is not out there, the fact that a certain percentage of voters in the South Carolina Republican primary thought the South should have won the Civil War is a reminder that the longue durée is indeed the longue durée, and people's view of the community may be quite different than what is the common narrative. The third issue, and Sophie's presentation was superb on this, so I should have given you some more slides. We have what I call the two-track problem. There is the humanitarian need imperative to deliver services, especially health, but also in water and sanitation, but the parallel problem that it takes a long time to build functioning education, health, water and sanitation, security and justice systems. But the more the imperative to deliver overrides the building of functioning bureaucracies, the longer we repeat the same problems. And the longer it goes on and on and on, because again, it's not just the humanitarian imperative, it's not just the need to deliver, it's the need of the functionaries in DFID, in AID, in the EC, in the World Bank, in Save the Children, in World Vision, to show that they have done bureaucratically correct things, even if it undermines the capacity, steamrollers the capacity, creates these highly overpaid separate units which simply rob any of the capacity from existing institutions. The fourth, which I think the taxation one really raises up, is that there are examples of institutional settlements that are quite different. Asymmetric decentralization, when you have the autonomous government of Mindanao, or you provide Aceh with more freedom and flexibility than the rest of Indonesia, and we don't have to go quite that far since Wilson and Vanessa traveled to us from a country which also has asymmetric decentralization in the imagined community called Quebec. So there are many political settlements where the institutional development is quite unique and doesn't fit a traditional pattern of how we understand creating the settlements. It has enormous implications on the taxation side and on the quality and the legitimacy of the government, depending on how the national or usually more federal settlement is taken. My final thought has to do with us. Working on many World Development Reports, and I don't know how that became my career, but World Development Report 2015 was called Mind, Behavior, and Society. And I'm very pleased with what the team produced, but I'm most pleased with the chapter which is about us. There's a chapter using surveys of World Bank staff, although I have to say DFID staff didn't do any better than World Bank staff, when they were asked to imagine the answers of people in Nairobi and usually got it wrong. And this was really about the fact that World Development Report 2015 talked about cognitive bandwidth, talked about biases, talked about mental models, and that us, the professionals, have all the same limitations based on our academic discipline, our job, where we've lived, but we somehow seem to think that there's this great neutral space where how institutions should be built in Afghanistan or how institutions should be built in Somalia, up in the clouds, Zeus and the other gods can sit there and make that decision. And I think it's not the case. And I think it creates a distance, a lack of understanding, sometimes an arrogance, and most of all, it becomes self-defeating. Because there's an expectation that those other people will behave in a way which is not only out of character for their history and culture, but actually out of character of how our own societies have evolved and how our own institutions have evolved. About 7 or 8 years ago, DFID had a paper produced by Alan Waits, who was a governance advisor there, and was called Testing the State Building Framework, trying to look at the nature of political settlements. And DFID commissioned 3 critical reviews, and I produced one of them. It was a study of how political settlements evolved in Cambodia and Laos. And there's nothing about it especially earth-shaking, but what I'm most proud of is I put a text box in there. And the text box said, if you went back to the early 1990s and asked the donors, the US and the UK, to select between Meles, Museveni, Mugabe, and Rawlings, and I then had an appendix of all the political statements praising Meles, the new prince, Museveni, Mugabe, and all the rest, almost nothing on good old Flight Sergeant Jerry Rawlings, I said, how many would predict that in 2009, the only functioning multi-party democracy with no political prisoners, with no suppression of the press, with no suppression of civil society would be Ghana? And I'm pleased to say the DFID reviewer simply used a text comment to say, ouch, and that was the last thing he had to say. So we need, most of all when it comes to building institutions, to be self-critical. Thank you.
I think in the larger donor practitioners community, there has been this gradual convergence that we need to understand the context much, much more deeply and understand exactly what problems are we trying to solve when we say we're building institutions. And to have that learning process, give the feedback. Is it really generating that sort of directional change? And should we revisit our assumptions? And the panelists all come from that learning process in your various thematic areas. And I'm sure some of the lessons resonate with those of you in the audience. I want to open it up and see whether you want to pose specific questions to the individual panelists or have your own reflection on some of the themes of lessons about what works and what doesn't. Juan, you can use the mic in front. Please also just introduce yourself at the beginning.
Yes, I'm Peter Morgan. I used to do consulting for the bank. I don't mean to be cynical or unpleasant, but I have been in this meeting many times before. I really didn't think you got to the issue which I thought was the topic under discussion. I think my friend was getting towards it, but I thought paused in midair. And I guess it's followed a traditional pattern, which is when it comes to institutional development, understand the context, understand the problem, but be somewhat muddled about your response. And I would point to three questions which I think were partially addressed. One is, what are the specific capabilities and policies that a donor needs to have to work effectively in the context of institutional development? I think you addressed this. Is institutional development just another development field, or does it have some specific demands that are needed? There are answers to that around. I think you addressed some of them. Second question, are donors actually interested in looking at themselves to see whether they have those capabilities? And the traditional answer to that has been no. I mean, in a sort of vague sort of way, but not in any serious way that other issues would attract attention. And the final issue is, are donors actually willing to reorganize themselves, and not just donors, but treasury boards, audit bureaus, evaluation groups, in support of those institutional issues? The answer to that has certainly been no. And I think it's basically because the ID issue contributes little to donor legitimacy. It's of minimal interest to senior managers. It's not an issue that will save an agency in difficult political and financial times. And therefore, a level of satisfactory underperformance, which is what we've always had, is more than enough. And we've ended up with a system in which we are, I think, locked in, which goes, I think, from decade to decade and generation to generation. I hope that wasn't too cynical.
Great. That's the right provocation. Well, let me collect a few other questions, and panelists can start preparing for this tough one. Please.
Thanks. So I'm one of these practitioners. I'm Michael Wilson from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, formerly AusAid in Australia. One of the things we wrestle with in our part of the world is institution building that's been unsuccessful for an awful long time. So take Papua New Guinea, which gained independence from its UN trustee, Australia, in 1975. And I think you could probably say the story hasn't improved. So we're starting to ask the question, when we talk about institution building, we automatically talk about institutions that we, on the donor side of the fence, recognise. From our own system, from our own education, from our own enculturation. And we assume that institutions that exist in partner countries now can and will work if we interact with them in the right way and they do the responsible thing. Do we ever ask whether alternative institutions are actually required and whether those sorts of institutions might be ones that we recognise and understand at all? And a second point, Wilson's question about legitimacy in the WDR 2017 framework. Absolutely, I think that WDR needs to give a strong focus on legitimacy, otherwise it misses the main point. But there is conflicting research on whether service delivery correlates with legitimacy. And what's our conclusion if development outcomes are actually pretty good despite problematic legitimacy? Because that means that we either start with legitimacy or development needs as a starting point. It's the same sort of argument as development and human rights. So I'd be interested in your reflections on that.
Hi, Julie Leonard with PwC. So I'm on that side of, I'm one of those I'm the consultant working in the different ministries, actually trying to build capacity and technical assistance. And one of the things I've noticed that's really lacking is the lack of political engagement on behalf of some of the donors. And I think you touched on it, Sophie, a little bit about how DFID had a lot of different advisors come in and out. Is that something that you've looked at? Do you have specific recommendations in terms of the different mechanisms for the donors to do that political engagement at the very top level, be it presidential level, prime minister's level, governors, and so forth? And as part of that, have you looked at all at some of the new thinking around twinning? Paul Collier has this new paper around the role of twinning and the type of mechanisms that could help build some of the peer-to-peer practitioner relationships, be it between UK government and Sierra Leone in this case. It'd be good to hear about that kind of gap that we're seeing. Thanks.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. I'm Fridtjof Torkelsen from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Oslo. The basic question for this session is, can donors build institutions? And in my experience, which goes back to '76 now in UNESCO, but now I'm working mainly on fragile states. And my answer will be yes. We can build the institutions that the regime in a given country want us, or they want. They may want it for financial reasons, they may want it for legitimacy, but we cannot build, for instance, a control system, public finance management system, which undermines the needs of the elite in a given country. So, and I can give you an example, my own experience from South Sudan. After 2005, we started building based upon the joint assessment mission that the World Bank and UN and a number of donors had made together with the partners, the governments, so SPLM in the south and the government of Khartoum in the north. And we had a huge, fine plan. In South Sudan, we built, quote, an anti-corruption commission. We all know what happened with corruption in South Sudan. Billions of dollars disappeared. We built this anti-corruption commission because it gave legitimacy to the SPLM government in the south. They wanted it, but they didn't want it to work. We then offered them, from the Norwegian side, the Oil for Development program, building capacity and competence in the field of oil and energy. And they were extremely eager to have that knowledge, not the least because it helped them to control how much money they actually should get from the north. So that was a successful, and in many cases, the Oil for Development programs we have around the world, based upon our experience, works well. But where that extra money goes from that capacity building is a totally different issue. So I think we have to, when we talk about donor capacity building programs, as the health ministry in Sierra Leone, of course they could, the government in Sierra Leone could really have built a good Ministry of Health if they had given priority to that. It's not strange that it doesn't. You can't find some kind of technical solution to that. It's a political issue. And that has been my experience also with Somalia, now since 2012, a New Deal country, pilot country. We have been involved in building up institutions in or units in the Ministry of Finance, but only units that really serves the purpose of the elite in Somalia. And the rest, it's not that they couldn't do it or get help from us, but they don't want it. So we have to understand the political context, the regime, and not mix up what is a technical problem with what is really a political problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'd just like to follow on from the previous speaker. Richard Hogg, I was previously head of DFID in Sierra Leone between 2005 and 2008. I remember an instance when we had been asked by DFID headquarters to develop and strengthen the anti-corruption body in Freetown. And we did at the start of my when I arrived in 2005, 2006, we spent quite a bit of money trying to strengthen the anti-corruption body. It soon became very obvious that, as the previous speaker said, it was a charade. It was a complete and utter charade. I tried to pull the plug on our funding for the anti-corruption body in Sierra Leone, and I was told by the then minister that we couldn't be seen to be pulling the plug on an anti-corruption body in Africa because it would look bad for the UK, and that we had to continue to fund it, although we knew it was a charade. So I think, the lesson for me was we have to look at the politics of our own organizations as well as the politics of the countries in which we work. And I think in that, we get a very complex picture of how to build institutions. Because we may know that what we're building is an absolute and utter charade, but our own institutional masters insist that it be done. And I think that's the politics of development that we should be looking at, not just the politics of Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, or South Sudan. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's a rich set of difficult questions already for the panelists. So why don't we take a turn from Simon, please.
Yeah, they are difficult questions. Peter, just picking up your point, the first job I did in development was 1990 in Lesotho, working in a very technical way in the Ministry of Finance. We got everything technically sorted out between 1990 and 1995. I went back in 2001, the country was exactly in the same position. As someone politely pointed out to me, sorting out the accounts and the financial management in a small country like Lesotho isn't just technical. I'm not so downbeat as you. I think the program that we have in South Sudan, I think does blend the technical and the financial. I think the situation in South Sudan is more problematic, it's more difficult. I'm not sure how much success we're having, but we are very explicitly blending the technical and the political. So I think we have learned a lot. I think Graham's sitting next to you. The discussion about thinking and working politically, I think we are certainly in the field of financial management, we are now thinking more politically. Whether that means we're any better, but I think we are thinking about those things. I think there are examples where we're more joined up. We are working in the Ministry of Finance, but we are trying to join up with colleagues in health, education. And I think siloed projects which don't spread across, I don't think are very successful. I think there's been more flexibility. Certainly the organisation which I'm in and the funding provision we've had in terms of flexible funding has enabled us to be flexible across a number of ministries. So I think that's been important. I think your point about donor incentives, I think, yes, there are all sorts of political things. I think one of the things that why DFID has changed is that despite DFID's budget increasing hugely, there's been huge constraints about its ability to use administrative costs. And so much of the work that DFID used to do in-house in terms of its engagement with ministries of finance or other ministries has now been outsourced to consultants. And I think in a way that, there are dynamics that Richard made in terms of the way donors respond to incentives. There's other things to say. Just picking up some of the other points. I think, yes, looking at our own politics, at Richard's point, is very important. I think the issue about, Julie made the point about your experience with PwC, twinning. I think twinning works in certain contexts. I think there's some very bad examples of where twinning has failed miserably. I can think again of a health example on that. But I think in a way, twinning in certain areas, certain very technical areas, like police, audit, tax, can work well. But I think the point is that most of what we do is not just hard technical skills. There are soft skills at stake here. And I think one of my concerns about the UK drive to get more UK expertise out, it's partly, again, there's a political drive there by the government in the UK, is that you need people with a combination of hard technical skills, but also a range of soft skills. And I worry that the hard skills may go in, but without the blend of soft skills that are needed. And I think that will be doomed to failure. I think I'm going to pass going first. I think I can dodge all the really difficult questions, so I'll just pass on.
I'm not taking the hard ones. No, I mean, I think most of what was said I would agree with, but I do think the question of incentives, and particularly in the donor institutions, for this topic anyway, is key. And I think one of the issues is around metrics to sort of measure institution building, because we all know that on the whole, the incentives which donor organisations face are around the ones that can be measured. So it's the service delivery, and certainly in the UK at the moment, there's a climate where you have to show results for everything. And what does that mean? That means the hard things you can measure. So to what extent is an organisation like DFID rewarded for building institutions? How can it communicate that to the public, that that's worth doing and spending money on? And I think that's a very hard thing to do, and partly because maybe we don't have the right metrics, or we're not talking about it in the right way to sort of make the case for that. So consequently, the incentives are not there. And I think that's part of the problem. And I think on the sort of question around political and technical, I do see them as kind of hand in hand. I think the politics are paramount, but at the same time, there's a lot of issues around systems. We all know that, you know, countries like Sierra Leone, just things like data is very hard to get. You know, even getting money down to a health facility, the channels don't work properly. There are lots of practical things which could help. You could get a virtuous circle of, you know, functioning systems which help to change some of the politics and the incentives as well. So I do think we have to sort of work on both. So maybe that's the same hard and soft point that you were making.
I mean, just one other point. I just remind, just I mean, we would say we follow some of the work that's been done more recently by Matt Andrews, this horrible acronym PDIA, Problem-Driven Iterative Adaptation. But actually the genesis of that goes back to Lindblom in 1959, had the science of purposive modelling. So you made the point, you know, understand and then model through. Well, actually, there's a strong tradition, and a good tradition actually of sometimes of doing that, which dates back to 1959. It's not particularly new. I think we've been doing that forever. And there are examples where muddling through and adapting and flexing your program and not going in a linear line when the world around you is changing is a very sensible thing to do. And actually driving forward when the world around you is changing rapidly isn't a very sensible thing to do. So in that sense, you do sometimes muddle through.
Right. I fear we're all just going to repeat ourselves and go all the way down the line. So I'll be very brief. And I mean, I think broadly I agree with all of this. And I guess I'm a political scientist. I mean, that is, I teach political science. So at some level, you know, echoing the first comment and parts of all the others, I guess when I think about a session on building institutions, it seems to me there's almost an existential question, which is, well, by now we sort of all know that it's about politics. That is, if the local sort of country doesn't want to build an institution, it's going to be really hard to do it. And likewise, if the systems on the donor side really don't want to build the institution, it's probably not going to work, no matter the technical barriers. And I mean, it's not worth forgetting that, because obviously in lots of cases, the politics causes these things to fail. But at some level, it's also very unsatisfying to just keep saying that over and over again in a session like this. And so I guess echoing Simon, you know, my sense of this is we want to remember that politics is always sort of the elephant in the room, but what we can do then is think about, well, what incrementally can we learn about particular systems, about particular contexts, about new strategies for muddling through that allow us to succeed a bit more than we would otherwise do, to navigate politics a bit better than we otherwise would. And so certainly think about the tax research, which is the part I know. You know, we look at the tax stuff, and I would say to anyone, when I think about reforming tax institutions, the first thing to say is, you know, if the country doesn't want to do it, it's not going to happen. But there are lots of countries that sort of want to do it, and what we try to do then is learn how to make that work a bit better, both in terms of understanding the context, which is what I presented today, but also in terms of understanding sort of technically how staff can engage more productively, more flexibly, more iteratively, to try to support those reform efforts in the best way possible. So I think even if politics looms really large, where the interesting action is in how we muddle better. I kind of like that way of thinking about it, but I won't go on any further, or we're just going to repeat even more.
Yeah, there's risk of that as well, as I may build off everything that's already been said. I think I'll focus a bit more on Michael's question of whether we need alternative institutions, whether alternative institutions are required, or what even that means. And I think that, you know, again, it goes back to, you know, a lot of the comments that were mentioned, the last two comments about politics. And here, looking at, you know, if we're thinking about second best options or alternative forms of governance at the local level, how does that coincide with institutional frameworks, with institutional and donor incentives? And I think that practically we're not quite clear right now about what that actually means. Also, given the risks that are involved with some of these, talking specifically about our research and what we're seeing that exists at the local level. On the one hand, these informal forms of governance can represent opportunities where the state is weak, where there are gaps in service delivery. But on the other hand, it can really create risks of empowering local institutions that aren't accountable, that aren't representative. If we're looking at I think we need to focus more then on the politics and going on to the discussion of the role of elites as well. I think it's relevant also, not just thinking about the elite environment at the national government level, but if we're looking at the local government level as well, the role of elites is really important. It's been really important, and there's evidence that it's been really important in our research as well. Thinking about community development associations, traditional authorities, who is driving institution building at the local level. But I think we also have a slightly more positive message in that, you know, to a certain degree, we can see that taxation can have a role in shaping politics, in as much as it involves citizens in the process. So then we see these forms of accountability where citizens, when they're paying taxes to local elites of different forms, there may be a slow building of representation of accountability that goes with that. So.
I think we actually outnumber the questioners so far. So. I think my rule would be it's only cynical if you throw down the question then walk out the door. So it's not so cynical. I mean, very quickly, and hopefully not repeating the previous points. I mean, one thing I would say is maybe the best thing that can happen to institutional development is if donors are really not interested in it. And if the institutional development field can marginalize itself as much as possible, then you really start to open up opportunities where it's not about spending money or channeling large amounts. It's about functional characteristics, right? I mean, there are two layers of conclusions here. One is that we can't build institutions. I mean, institutions is what happens. Of course we can't make that happen, but we're even pretty crappy at building organizations. There's a whole level of things where we can't even build functioning formal structures. The tragedy of donor work is that we live in a universe of forms, but development happens in the world of functions. And so the more we can get away the idea that this is a field in itself and is something that we should be doing provocatively, I propose is the conclusion that donors aren't interested in it, that it's politically sensitive or political incentives at the donor level or government level or within implementers as well run in the wrong direction. What do you do about that then? I think genuinely there is a kind of limited field of play, but a very promising one, and a lot of it has to do with the kind of functionally related approach, problem-solving related approaches, problem-driven approaches, for services approaches. I mean, briefly drawing on an experience I had in PFM for Health in Timor, and I'm really happy to see a kind of PFM for Health community developing here at the bank and talking about technical solutions to political, either very locally political or more nationally political problems in service delivery. You know, what we did there was go out and run around health clinics and find out what their problem was, and then think about a technical set of tools that might help solve that problem without any idea what we were going to do at the beginning. And it took very little money, and it took a significant amount of time. But I mean, I have some PFM background, but I ended up learning about impressed systems because that was what was being used. The closest analogy is a bar float. You know, this is how these were being running. And until you changed the impressed system, which was basically a holdover of how the UN administration manages expenses, you weren't going to be able to get more money or more fuel into the hands of these clinics, which was really what they wanted. So I would put in a little bit of a vote for the technical, actually. We're always saying we need to be more political. The technical, if it's aimed at a political problem, provides an avenue to speak in a non-threatening way in the world of forms that we live in about a problem which is functional. But it has to go in that direction. The second point would just be this issue of legitimacy and results. I mean, Rachel, who's in the audience, who leads the SLRC at ODI, has the phrase, "Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater," right? The idea that development projects should all be driven by the desire to build institutions is what I'm saying shouldn't be the kind of driving factor. That should be a means, if a part of it at all. On the other hand, in fragile settings, we need ways to smooth the path to functional institutions. And the way that the activities you're carrying out kind of align with the way politics happens has got to be a consideration in whether you're going to have a smooth path to delivering healthcare or a very bumpy path, et cetera. And so I think that's, to me, the relationship with the technical. I think for people like ourselves to abandon the technical and to just become political economists is actually the wrong approach. It is the marriage of the two that Simon talked about, but in the different order than we usually we do a deficit analysis. What technical skills or capacities are missing, and then let's fill them in. It's the opposite of that approach, actually, which is where the technical should come in. But people need to be technically competent to make a contribution.
I'm always glad when I can come away from a session with at least one great phrase, and satisfactory underperformance is certainly one that I'm going to take away as a bureaucratic statement. But let me pick up on that, because it raises a very interesting question about the institution or the enabling environment. And I'll maybe contrast, as we've been talking, satisfactory underperformance versus muddling through. Because what I'm picturing is satisfactory underperformance means basically the powers that be, the political leaders, the institutional managers, don't really care so long as no crisis comes to their desk. As long as the reports come in, the boxes are checked, not too much money has disappeared, nobody has been seen doing anything immoral, unethical that'll appear in the newspaper or on the BBC. And so it's satisfactory. It's not very good, but it's satisfactory. Muddling through could actually be a very positive idea within a bureaucracy where the leadership, the manager, the executive director says, look, it's difficult in South Sudan. It's difficult in Sierra Leone. Working in Helmand province or Kandahar province in Afghanistan is nightmarish. We don't expect you to be successful today or tomorrow or a year from now. But if you can get 3 people trained in financial management, if you can get 5 women's groups going in savings associations, if you can show that in between bombings and people losing their jobs and displacement of 10,000 people because they're afraid of some group blowing up the marketplace, then I think muddling through is pretty good. Now, the problem with muddling through is that for the higher-ups who have to report to Parliament or the Board of Directors, it's very unsatisfactory, because your metrics aren't great, you don't meet your performance standards, you don't satisfactorily underperform. Instead, you say, I'm going to take reality and deal with reality. And I think it raises up an interesting question. In the session this morning, Nigel Roberts talked about the World Development Report 2011 and how there have been parts of it that had basically pointed out that some of the origins of violence in the world had to do with G7 BRIC countries, and how that was very carefully, for the most part, excised out of the report. That gap between the professional norm of doing the work or telling the truth and the powers that be runs through the international aid system. It's not just the World Bank or DFID. It's present in most of the big NGOs. I just had lunch with a former student of mine who's a brilliant Eritrean logistics genius who worked for one of the biggest international NGOs, and they've brought in 4 or 5 corporate types from the Walmarts and Dells of the world. They have no clue what it means to deliver in Mozambique or Ethiopia, but they now have imposed these performance metrics. So I think one of our fundamental challenges, going back to we've met the enemy and he is or she is us, is that in our institutions, almost all of them, whether nonprofit or I'd say the big foundations or the NGOs, there's a fundamental gap between what is perceived as the public image of performance and what those who've been moved into the top want to measure, and the reality of muddling through. And maybe just because I'm getting old enough now I don't care about my next job, I think that's something we have to tackle and be honest about.
Let me share some thoughts also because of the WDR 2017 work. I mean, this is not our main focus, but there are 2 types of research that I find really useful. I mean, I think some of you already echoed that we seem to be converging, but then it's still this muddled field. We're just talking. And I, in our WDR 2017 scan of literature, I find we have some insights from the good research in this field. One, I want to address the isomorphic mimicry critique that Land and Andrew and Woolcock very usefully put together. I mean, challenging the donor community. And I think some of the speakers spoke up about it before, that we are part of the crime of importing certain forms and allowing our counterpart to derive that legitimacy from merely copying the form, but not really doing the hard job of real reform. And we are doing it, and we fail to stop it, like Richard was saying about DFID, right? Because of our internal political reasons and legitimacy that agency needs from their politicians. Now, that is it was a very sharp critique of the donor community. I think we all recognize ourselves from time to time, from place to place. And we find it incomplete in the following sense. On the one hand, we very much accept the challenge and really want to drive deeper into the functional problems rather than the look of the forms. And I think that's also where people already converge. What is the real problem here? What is the state not doing that they actually want to do, and whatever form of governance they decide to choose? Right, so democracy, for example, the variety of democracy data that's coming up now is healthy because it's trying to measure multi-dimensions of democratic practice, not just from the electoral point of view, which Polity4 and other indexes have been measuring for a long time, but also from other dimensions, deliberative democracy, for example, and social inclusion of different groups. And so looking in terms of recognizing diverse forms might serve similar functions. And with your eyes open, going into an arena and say, who is collecting money And in exchange for what? What are they delivering? How do they derive legitimacy, whether they're state actors or traditional authority or rebels during the wartime? So part of the security chapter in the WDR is actually looking at those alternative governance arena where those who are governing are not the state. Those who are governing may be the religious authorities, maybe the rebels, and how do they construct their authority? How do they build their own legitimacy? And that's sort of keep your eyes wide open, look for different ways of governing. But we want to go back to the question of forms. Are forms completely useless? And what we actually come to now is forms sometimes beget functions. Okay, and I want to elaborate on this a little bit more, that when does form beget functions? And these anti-corruption agency is an example, but also lots of laws and lots of agencies that we all help create, Auditor General's Department, anti-corruption, and many different forms. Now, Marilyn Grindel's work is really useful. I mean, Marilyn Grindel's work is often cited on the good enough governance framing of it, but her really good qualitative work and historical research on institutional reform areas, for example, Job for the Boy book, just bureaucratic meritocracy, an idea that we all accepted is probably useful when a society, a state wants to be effective. At some point, you want to think about what kind of minimum quality you want the bureaucrats to have, what type of meritocratic promotion system you want to develop, and vis-a-vis the patronage, which was the status quo for many countries, and still many countries today. She studied that one particular reform, but look at historical cases of 4 developed countries and 6 developing countries, right? And looking at that long duration of reforms. And what she usefully framed is both in terms of the change of the law, which is already a big political struggle. Right? You need to construct the sort of coalition to even want to change the law, to say today, recruitment purely based on patronage is no longer acceptable. We want to put in some system to have meritocracy. But in her book, what the real insight is, that's just the beginning, right? That is a genuine political process, unlike many of our countries where maybe our donor agencies have leverage. We can twist people's arms and put in those laws when their political process is not really there to genuinely adopt a reform like that. But in her case studies, these are cases where these countries had a reason to adopt that law. But the implementation process is now confronting a different nature of political problem. Right? When the coalition you need for putting some law in place may be a big coalition, maybe a small coalition, depending on how robust that legislative process is. In some places, we all know, we probably drafted something for our counterpart in the ministry to pass it as a policy statement or as a law. But when you do implementation, you cannot avoid the real coalition of people you need to get things done and the kind of incentive you need to make people accountable for those reforms. And that's the difficult political project. I mean, so she used the après reform, as just the catchword for that second phase. And in those countries, they are all multi-decades reform process, even for something like meritocracy. Even in the US, right, we are all familiar with the Pendleton Act of 1982, how more than 5 decades it took for the US federal government to reduce the patronage hiring in federal government from 85% to 15%. Right? I mean, that is a long process. So this sort of research goes much beyond what Land did for WDR 2011, which says, okay, we're looking at the CPI indicators, looking at Haiti to Ghana with the best of luck, it takes 41 years. Now everybody starts quoting that number, right? It's only useful, insightful in the sense that it's generational challenge, not a short-term challenge that matches our timeline. But it's Marilyn Grindle type of work that really gives you the real political story of the coalition building that's necessary for introducing a reform, and the coalition really necessary for sustaining a reform. And I think the more we build on our experience, but with systematic research that gives the systematic insight, the more useful our dialogue will be pushing forward. So the other piece that I felt useful that the World Bank, the WDR 2011 is spending a lot of time on is under what conditions elites want to do the difficult reforms that we also love for them to do, right? That genuine political interest and work like Daniel Bellina's type of work, and he, for example, just picks one law, this is the transparency law, right to information law, and he used, for example, the Mexican study. When federal government has decided to adopt transparency reform, because it's a federal system, the states don't have to, or the states can choose their own timing in adopting that law. And that kind of context where you control the national dynamic and yet you can explore the variation in subnational power dynamic and really empirically use the regression method to explain the timing of adoption at the state level, but using political explanatory variables such as the degree of political competition, so how likely you are losing, and therefore adopting an insurance mechanism, for example, by adopting a law that binds the hand not of you, but of the future ruler who may not be you. That sort of analysis, again, is really helpful because for us to have an assessment of what kind of political setting are we working in, and when is it in the elite's interest to adopt something, both for their current short-term political interests, but then also have the potential of forms begetting function. And that's the most interesting frontier area that we are looking into. So I want, and we have just 4 more minutes. I wonder whether anybody in the audience want to, if you know of really interesting systematic analysis of this kind of understanding context, understanding the real politics of reforms, not just the reform of law, but reforms, the implementation stage of the reform. Please shout and share, and I think we can progress collectively as a community.
My name is Verena Fritz. I'm a senior public sector specialist, and just to mention, we have a follow-up session to this one at 4 o'clock, where we'll dig a bit deeper also into some of these issues of capacity development and how we are progressing on that. I think we have some good examples, but I very much agree with one of the earlier statements that we don't fully acknowledge the politics. So the problem in some of these difficult environments is not so much that we can't know them, but that acknowledging that the politics are there and that they are difficult, but then not getting too scared by that and still saying, well, then we can still achieve the following. That's really a fundamental aspect. And I think another one, and one that I think we'll also highlight in the following session, is that you often find a mutual frustration. You find a frustration between the government and the development partners. And part of that gets expressed that we have no clue how much progress we are making. There's no measure of it. So it goes to your point, there's no metrics, we don't know where we are. And so I think making, and in certain areas it's probably a little bit easier. So if we work on tax administration, we can see whether revenue collection is going up, and we can look at the different tax categories. But in this broader field of our institutions functioning better, I think we need to have a lot more of this intermediate indicators that give us some ideas of are we even heading in the right direction, what's going right, what's going wrong. And to my mind, that's really one of the aspects for us to go forward. But yeah, I'll be looking forward to continuing the discussion.
That's a plug for the 4 o'clock session for those who want to stay.
Hi, Geoffroy Groslo from the IRC. A slightly different tack and slightly less existential compared to some of the questions earlier, and more instrumental, since, institution building will get funded anyway, so let's try to find better ways of doing it. And the gist of my remark is that a lot of the reforms are really focusing on central level institution, Ministry of Finance, Treasury Board, Public Service Commission, etc. And very few of those types of reform that try to make the public sector work better actually trickle down to the districts and the facilities. And I find, and I think, that these central level reforms, it's much easier for form to prevail over function. That is, you know, you go work with the nice guy with the nice suit at the Ministry of Finance, you walk out of the building and the reform just ended at the door. So it's really important to dedicate some attention to how, yes, you need those central institutions to work sooner or later. But I think as you work on those institutions, you need to work from below. And I really like the tack about local taxation, because this is the critical point that very few donors are working on. We want to sustain service delivery, but we never think about how these countries are going to have resources to actually fund service delivery. And when you go in the field in places like DRC, my favorite place, it's like basically there's taxation there. People are paying to send their kids to school. They're paying to go to the clinics. All of this is completely unregulated, not followed, not monitored. But you have all these things that are happening there. And it's like both a bit formal, a bit informal. There's great opportunities to work at those levels. You know, the ideas of island of excellence is not new, but great potential while you also work at the top. Not just working at the top thinking that things will trickle down one day. To me, that seems to be a very, very big gap of all these discussion about institution building. We build ministries, we build laws, we build organograms, but we don't build how to actually get money down to districts and down to facilities. And that's, we need to work at it really both ways.
I unfortunately have to close because we need to vacate this place for the arena session at 4 o'clock. But I encourage people to maybe talk bilaterally outside at the coffee place. But I want to thank all the panelists for coming, share your experience, and thank Steve for organizing this session.